which would initiate a process that will begin the work of resolving the very serious issues which are central to the crises at the heart of the retained fire service. Because we need to be very clear here, Minister, the retained fire service is in crisis, and it has been for a very, very long time. The recruitment and retention crisis is worryingly fast approaching a critical point from which it may well be unable to recover. In 2005, Minister, Sub-Officer Brian Murray led a walkout from Bray Fire Station, and this was done out of concern at the condition of the retained fire service. He told me, Minister, that someone would die unless the very serious issues in the service were addressed. Within 2 years, Minister, Sub-Officer Brian Murray and his colleague firefighter Mark O'Shaughnessy were killed while tackling a blaze. And some members of the families are here in the public gallery this evening, Minister, as are many members of the retained service. And I've no doubt the gallery would have been absolutely packed with retained firefighters, only due to the challenges in terms of trying to get time off to come here for this. But, Minister, the deaths of Mark and Brian were caused by the systematic failures within a service that simply is not fit for purpose. And firefighters say that 15 years after Brian and Mark's deaths, conditions are worse. And while you, Minister, may point to investments in new fire stations and equipment, which is to be welcomed, this is meaningless without having the personnel to staff, to man the fire stations and to go on the tenders. And the reality is that situations continue to arise on your watch, Minister, where fire services are simply unable to respond to emergencies due to a shortage of personnel. And many one-pump stations are supposed to have crews of 9. They're operating with 50% of the establishment figures with 4 or 5 personnel, and not only putting their safety at risk, but also that of the public's. In my hometown of Bray, for example, the fire station, which is supposed to be a 2-pump station with 15 firefighters, currently only has 9. And it hasn't been able to operate a 2-pump station for the last 5 years at least. And that is the case, Minister, in many areas right across the state. And in other instances, fire stations have been forced off the run due to a shortage of personnel. The service was designed for the 1950s, and it simply isn't fit for purpose in the 21st century. And across the state, retained firefighters are in the process, Minister, as you're well aware, of balloting for industrial strike action. And it is something they felt that they were forced into doing as a result of the failure of government to engage or to make any meaningful attempt to deal with the recruitment and retention crisis. And in many areas that have balloted already, the results are overwhelming, 97% in support of taking industrial or strike action. And they are being forced to do this simply because of the concerns they have for their own safety, but the safety of the public as well. And Minister, I urge you to take heed. This crisis is not going away, unfortunately. It is very real, it is very dangerous, and it has the potential to impact on citizens right across the state. If they ever find themselves unlucky enough to have to need the services of the retained fire service, and the day has come that they are unable to answer the call because the government has failed them. And to the finding of a recent survey of serving retained firefighters indicate that 60% of them in the service are intending to either retire or resign within the next 18 months or 2 years. So, Minister, the retained fire service simply won't recover from such a loss of experienced personnel. No organisation could survive that, Minister, least of all an organisation that battles life and fire situations, life and death situations on a daily basis. Minister, members of the House, particularly those of the government parties, I'm asking you to put aside the party differences and support this motion. because I think this motion will allow for a cross-party committee to hear from key witnesses and stakeholders, listen to the experts about the issues that are crippling the service, and bring forward key recommendations for the government to act upon. And it will complement any other measures that are being undertaken by government or other bodies. Because the reality is, if we want to have a fit-for-purpose emergency retained fire service, things must change immediately. Let's listen to the firefighters. Let's listen to their motion. This is their motion, Minister. Let's pass it and work together and put in place a fire service, a retained fire service that is fit for purpose, that is fit for the 21st century.
Deputy, you're sharing with Deputies McLaughlin, Crowe, Munster, Stanley, O'Brien and Maiden. Deputy McLaughlin.
Minister, we read statements last week in the Dáil here after the tragedy at Creeslough, and our fire services in Donegal were called to respond to that, and indeed fire services across the border. And over all the years of road tragedies, in some cases I think of any shown where 8 people lost their lives in the one incident, we called on the fire service to respond. When the family tragedy in my hometown of Buncrana drowned at our pier, it was the fire services who were at the pier side. That's what we asked them to do. It's an incredibly demanding job, a traumatic job. I remember one time a member of the fire service in Donegal told me that he attended a road traffic accident and there was loss of life, and it came into his head that perhaps his son could be amongst them, but he just got on with the job, and he was one of the fortunate families that didn't get bad news. But that's what we asked them to do. That's what we ask of our fire service. So this motion is about getting to the point as soon as we can where we have a fire service that's fit for purpose, where the issue of pay and conditions is addressed once and for all, that we don't put impossible demands. We thank them as politicians in this Dáil and across the country again and again. This is about putting substance once and for all and putting in place a fire service that they get what they deserve for representing us. So that's what this is about, and I commend the fire service personnel who are here today to protest. They're up in the gallery, and I hope the government does the right thing and we work together, cross-party, to solve this problem once for all.
Deputy Sean Crowe.
Minister, you know it's a daily occurrence that fire brigade vehicles are unavailable for deployment owing to insufficient firefighters to staff them. You know that yourself. Staff are constantly battling exhaustion owing to, we're told, repeated requests to work overtime and to cover staff's shortages. That's what I've been told by the firefighters. Simply put, we're putting our firefighters and the general public in danger. We're gambling every day with people's lives. And this is not a new issue. I want to focus on Dublin Fire Brigade. They've been highlighting for years severe understaffing and inaction from government. Staff shortages directly affect the emergency response services of fire groups like Dublin Fire Brigade and must be prioritised. Understaffing or delayed response times put the public at serious risk, and on-call vehicles leaving stations with less than a full complement of firefighters is putting the crews and the public at risk. Dublin, as we know, is constantly growing. It's a city of well over 1 million inhabitants. Buildings are getting higher, so we need a fire service that has the equipment, the staff, the capacity and the capability to respond to fires and all potential incidents. There was a major apartment block fire in Tala last year, which required the bulk of Dublin Fire Brigade's resources on site to deal with the fire and the evacuation of residents. Had a major incident, a bad crash on the M50 or a fire on the north side, the results would have been disastrous, with Dublin Fire Brigade forced to triage and divert resources in the face of a serious threat to life. We must establish this Oireachtas Committee, Minister, and conduct a full and independent review of how the National Fire Service is delivered across the state. It should be a short and sharp review of the situation and interview key case stakeholders as has been outlined. We must get to grip with this situation and put the solution in place before another year passes. The current situation is putting crews and the public at risk. The current situation is putting the lives of everyone at risk.
Minister, the retained fire service in Ireland carries out an invaluable service within all our communities right across the state. The work that the members of the service undertake involves significant sacrifice, yet the pay and working conditions of the job don't match the significant time, effort and sacrifice involved, so it's little wonder that the service is hemorrhaging firefighters. The loss of such dedicated, highly trained and experienced personnel is a huge loss to the services, and it has to be addressed. And the result of the loss of personnel is that the remaining firefighters are put under extreme pressure, and this is compounded then by recruitment and retention problems. We're seeing this in every single local authority right across the state. A recent study conducted by the Department of Housing laid bare the difficulties facing the service. Almost 60% said that they intend to leave the service in the near future. That represents a crisis in the service, Minister, and if those figures come to pass, then it would mean the collapse of the service within a few short years. In Drogheda, the largest town in Ireland, since 2016, our retained ranks have not been operating at full complement. At the present time, only 6 out of 10 positions for retained firefighters are filled, and this is a problem right across County Louth. And when you look, Minister, at the terms and conditions of these workers, it becomes very clear why that situation has arisen. These firefighters work 6 24-hour shifts in a row with only 2 days off. That's 144 hours per week, during which they have to maintain a 5-minute response time to their station. And as Drogheda, just as one example, grows in size and the housing crisis worsens, this is becoming increasingly untenable and totally unrealistic. Some firefighters are finding it impossible to make the turnout time, which in turn then affects their pay. I know of one firefighter who sits in his car in a car park all day when he's on call in order to make his response time. Other issues affecting retention include insufficient rest periods between shifts and pay that does not reflect the work carried out by the firefighters. And your government, Minister, and yourself need to meet with representatives of the service. Enough is enough at this stage. We also need a thorough review of the entire service across the state to address the issues that I've mentioned. And if the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Housing was tasked with this review, we could have that report by early spring, which would allow for real reform sooner rather than later. Minister, the time for government to act is now.
And welcome the opportunity to speak on this. The proposals being put forward here by Sinn Féin are to address the retention crisis, particularly in the retained firefighters sector, Minister. And this is something you must address. We haven't time on our side. Correspondence from the National Retained Firefighters Association outlines that the current staffing levels is now at crisis point. It's no longer fit for purpose, and 60% of staff intend to retire or exit in the near future. We're at crisis point due to the failure of governments not engaging with the retained firefighters representatives, and there's a danger to the safety of both the firefighters and to the public. Pay and conditions have deteriorated to the point where crews now feel that they have no option but to consider reluctantly industrial action, with reported ballot results returning 97% in favour of industrial action in some areas. And that's indicative of the crisis we're facing. Firefighters are having to work extra hours, forgo family time, and the retainer pay they received doesn't come close to compensating them for these sacrifices. Staff shortages are at a critical point across the state, and I've raised this with the Taoiseach here before on the floor of it all, including in Laois and Offaly. New recruits are not arriving into the service. We need a solution quickly. Crews are on call 24/7 in these areas, 24/7/12, and they're in understaffed stations. In Rathdowney, for example, the crew is down to 5 people, 5, where there's supposed to be 9 minimum. Abbeyleix is at 6. That's the situation we're in. I want the Department to prioritise the need for new fire stations as well in Rathdowney and Stradbally in County Laois. However, unless we address the staffing issues, increased capital investment, Minister, and new stations and modern equipment will be meaningless. Sinn Féin is calling for the establishment of this joint all-party committee. Let's work together on this to have the independent review of the fire services. The review has to consult with all stakeholders and examine pay conditions and the management and rosters within the service, and should be completed within 4 months. Minister, the time for reform of the service can't be delayed any longer, and I welcome the retained firefighters here today to make their case. I think it's a very positive move, and we need to hear what they're saying loud and clear and act on it.
Thank you, Chair. And first of all, I'd like to commend my colleague John Brady for his tireless advocacy on behalf of all fire service workers, both retained and otherwise. And I also want to welcome the men and women of the retained fire service. I think everybody here today will commend their bravery, Minister. Every time they go out on a call, they put their lives or their health at risk. And they're not just firefighters, they're involved in cardiac arrests, vehicle crashes, river rescues, chemical spills and environmental protection. Earlier today I took just a few minutes to go out and speak to them, to ask them, what do they want me to tell you? What do they want us to impress to you, Minister, here on the floor of the Dáil today? And what they made very clearly is the service is in crisis. The 24/7, 365 call-out regime simply is broken and must be changed. And they said unless they are adequately paid and unless their rosters reflect the reality of working times, then they're not only going to be able not to retain, they won't be able to recruit. And therefore there's an urgency around this that I don't think anybody can underestimate. They also made it very clear that it is becoming increasingly difficult to recruit young people because of the cost of childcare and the cost of living. And they're keen to have additional training, particularly to ensure they're able to do the very best job for the communities and for themselves. I don't think there's a single member of the retained fire services who voted for industrial action who wants to take that action. They want you to act. They want you to ensure that they do not have to take the action that they are balloting for. So all I'd ask you to do, Minister, today is support this motion, support the very sensible propositions by Deputy Brady, support the men and women in the gallery, and ensure that they get the right pay, terms and conditions, and the communities get the service that they rightly deserve.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I wish to begin by paying my respect to the outstanding service and commitment of the firefighters nationally and those in County Wexford, some of whom are in the gallery this evening. Their dedication to their communities is second to none. Their passion for their job is exemplary. They're often the first on the scene for emergencies such as car crashes, cardiac arrests and suicide attempts. They're often the first port of call in providing much-needed support for families in their time of troubles. The current setup of the retained fire service is not workable. Recruitment has reached an all-time low because of the stark pay and conditions that currently exist. Pressures on their families are enormous. There are significant issues with work-life balance. As one firefighter put it, when you join the retained fire service, your family joins with you. There is a substantial question mark over EU law and whether standby hours count as working time under the Working Time Directive, as was ruled in favour of a Belgian retained firefighter in 2018. These issues are happening within the context of other crises too. In County Wexford, you must live within 2.5 kilometres of the station to be a part of a retained crew. With the acute housing crisis, this is near impossible for people, and many cannot secure a mortgage. The cost of living crisis is putting additional pressures on our crews, and we are seeing experienced and passionate firefighters having to leave the job because of financial pressure. This loss of expertise is detrimental to the service. I have spoken to the firefighters, and they are adamant that within 5 years or less, there will be no one left in the service if the current conditions are allowed to continue. We need an Oireachtas committee to conduct a full and independent review of how the nation's full fire service is delivered. We need key recommendations on the issues outlined today, such as pay, conditions and management structures within the service. It's no use, Minister, providing new fire stations if you have no one to man them. What you're doing, Minister, is like buying a new car, but too late you discover there's no one to drive it. I ask all deputies to support this motion.
Look, Minister, I'll take the positives from what you said. It was the acceptance that the model in relation to retained firefighters at this point in time is not working, that the issue as regards pay and conditions, rostering, and the fact that it's not attractive at this point in time needs to be dealt with. Well, look, in fairness, I think that's why these people are here in the watching proceedings above us at the moment. That's the reason a huge amount of firefighters made the journey to Dublin. We all realise that we're all talking about local authorities across this state that are under severe pressure in relation to being able to put a full quotient of firefighters in operation, and in an awful lot of cases they can't put that full complement, and that means you're dealing with firefighters that are under severe pressure. Look, people spoke, you spoke yourself, Minister, as did Pádraig McLaughlin, about what firefighters had done in Creasla. I know what they've done. The last time that I went to visit a scene was close to my house, where there was a waste plant in Dundalk where firefighters had bravely fought the flames and had brought it under control. I know the huge work myself and Anton Waters would have spent a considerable amount of time out when firefighters were fighting fires over many occasions on the Cooley Mountains. And look, we all realise the absolute necessary work that needs to be done. But look, people have talked about 6 24-hour shifts, 144 hours a week. That's split by then 2 days and then another 6 days of the same. Sure, that's just not doable in any way, shape or form. So, Minister, whether you're going to agree with our motion and whether we're going to follow through in relation to the review process that we're talking about, or whether you are talking an alternative. The one thing that we know is we have a system that is absolutely ready to fail. I know in the county of Louth, Imelda Munster, and I know Joanna Byrne has been to the forefront in talking about the huge difficulties there are in Drogheda, but we know retained firefighters from Carlingford to Drogheda that we do not have a system that's working, that's fit for purpose, and we really need action to happen as soon as possible. We don't particularly care how you do it, just make it happen as soon as possible.
I'd like to commend as well Deputy Brady for proposing this motion, and he has a long history of advocacy on this issue, and credit must also go to the National Retained Firefighters Association. We debate health and emergency measures in this House on a regular basis, and the issues that occur in other areas are unfortunately relevant here too. Fire services are understaffed to dangerous levels, and experienced firefighters are leaving at a rapid rate. The sacrifices we ask these individuals to make on our behalf are extreme, and many face the risk of death and injury on a weekly basis. A poor work-life balance, bad conditions and paltry pay all play a role in many walking away. With only 8,500 guaranteed income, many find obtaining a mortgage a struggle. This is in a job where you're on call 24/7 with less days off per year than similar jobs. This puts a massive strain on people and their families. I spoke to one firefighter from Kerry today who said that he could be out in the car with his children, and he gets a call to go to the fire station, and his partner or wife has to come to the station as well. So families are on call too. Pensions are poor, and as a result, progression is difficult with a top-heavy management structure. In Kerry, for instance, there has been regular gorse, grass and bushfires. Radio Kerry reported in one weekend last summer that nearly 2/3 of calls were related to these type of fires, and firefighters need to be supported when such events occur. There is a particular crisis with retention in Kerry. In larger towns like Tralee or Killarney, there can be a number of calls, but this decreases across the county. In addition, firefighters face difficulty when it comes to weather warnings, with no nationally agreed protocols on whether it's safe for them to work or not during such warnings. The National Directorate has no representation on it from retained firefighters, and there's a worrying element of confusion in the future of the service, which was added to recently by the Taoiseach. He recently told my colleague Brian Stanley that the issues must be dealt with in the context of existing industrial relations mechanisms by the local authorities, but more recently changed his tune and questioned whether local authorities should have retained firefighters at all, and that is not good enough for the public or for workers. We need an urgent pay review of pay and conditions on a cross-party basis, and I'm calling on all Kerry TDs to support this motion. Thank you.
Deputy Clerk.
Initially, I note that a copy of the Minister's speech hasn't been circulated. Perhaps that could be rectified before the end of the debate. The cause and effect of why we are debating this tonight is clear. A lack of political leadership over many years, an almost disdain for retained fire services, a model of delivery that is broken, and now 60% intending to leave, many within the next year. And Minister, I am somewhat perplexed in the amendment submitted by Government as to how you see fit to compare our firefighters with other staff in local authorities. With the greatest of respect to them, apples and oranges come nowhere near that level of comparison. Increases in capital investment, refurbishment of stationary, new equipment is all meaningless if there simply aren't enough firefighters to use it. And any investment needs to be done based on a fit-for-purpose model and with the appropriate oversight. The retained firefighters cannot retain experienced personnel, nor recruit significant new members due to the pay and conditions within the job. That is what the focus of Government should be. And I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the role of our retained fire services, these valued first responders from both County Westmeath and Longford who are here this evening with their colleagues, for their tireless work, for their commitment, and also to their families and to their employers, without whose support they simply wouldn't be able to do that valuable work that we need them to do and that we ask them to do. Because despite all the problems, and you have listed many yourself, Minister, they show up, they do their job and they serve our communities to the best of their abilities. And yet, contained in Government amendments, you have the audacity to quote 4.3 deaths per million of population of fire fatalities, as if these firefighters' only role is to turn up to fires, because that's what's insinuated in this. We are all in agreement that this situation cannot be allowed to continue. And I am going to ask, as my colleagues have done before, that you support this motion, because the review you mentioned was also apparently went to drafting to you in February. It is now November, Minister. The commitment by the firefighters is simply not being met in the same level of commitment by Government, and that is a fundamental flaw to any approach and to any solution that may be laid forward. These are professional and dedicated people. They want to make the fire service better. They want to make it safer place to work for all of their members, but that commitment needs to be met by Government.
I'd like to welcome the firefighters here in the gallery and to thank them for bringing this to the Dáil. You are the courageous men and women who put your lives on the line for us on a daily basis, and we owe you a debt of gratitude. Fire services face huge challenges when it comes to keeping their firefighters ready for the dangerous tasks they face each day, in their response times, and in making sure that they can keep communities safe. However, it is clear that there is a developing crisis in the fire services, particularly in relation to retention. In a report to be completed by the end of the year by a project team under the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage into the recruitment and retention issues within the retained fire services, some of its conclusions show that 74% of retained fire services have difficulty in recruiting firefighters, while a further 45% have difficulty in retaining firefighters. Staff shortages has meant that up to 4 fire trucks were not in service because the fire service did not have the staff to man them. This is a very serious matter and has huge implications for not just the safety of the firefighters, but also for their ability to carry out the tasks assigned to them in a safe and professional manner. If a fire station does not have a sufficient number of firefighters, then the fire station does not have the ability to carry out all its necessary functions, such as being able to adequately put out a fire at a premises, carry out search and rescue, ensure proper ventilation, water supply, and ensure rapid intervention, all of which requires a big team. This should be a minimum standard, particularly in a constituency like Dublin North West, which is populated by large housing estates, high-rise apartment blocks and big hotels. Retained fighters face even bigger challenges and face uncertainty on a daily basis. Retention and adequate budgets impact on the fire service operation, including its training, proper equipment and maintenance of the services. It also impacts on firefighter safety concerns. The safety of firefighters is a critical concern for all of us. They have a dangerous and stressful job. They risk long-term health issues by being exposed to the smoke that may contain carcinogens. For our part, it is our responsibility as public representatives to keep our firefighters safe and free from all the problems they are facing. While the fire service is under-resourced and understaffed, all our lives and the lives of the members of the fire service are put at risk. Minister, just to finish, last Friday I spent over 2 hours at the scene of an accident, and it took that long to get fire ambulance and ambulance services to the scene. The problem was that there was ambulances and fire ambulances sitting outside the hospital, acting like a ward because they couldn't get in. They're overcrowding in there and they couldn't move them in the hospital. That needs to be looked at very seriously.
And I want to start by thanking my colleague John Brady for all of his work, and I want to also welcome the men and indeed women of the retained fire service who are here with us this evening, and the many more who we know are watching in. And everyone that has spoken has recognised the same thing. There's a lot of people who cannot be here by virtue of the fact that they are actually on call. They have to be close to their home place so that they can protect their own communities. Minister, you sought to give us a little lecture there on what you do and don't think is reasonable. Well, in my opinion, a reasonable government would wake up to the stat that 60% of the retained firefighters are considering resigning or retiring in the next 2 years. 60%, and they are not unreasonable people. In fact, they are some of the most flexible and reasonable people that we have providing services in this state. So I don't know what a reasonable government would take on board that statistic. A reasonable government would be concerned. A reasonable government would listen. A reasonable government would be alert to the terms and conditions and the fact that these men and women are providing services on a shoestring in many instances. It's no wonder that we struggle to get people into the fire service and to retain people in the fire service, given that they are struggling to get simple things like a mortgage because of the way that their wages are structured. The Senior Minister, when he was here, told us that the firefighters keep their own communities safe. Well, last night, the fire service from Skerries in my own town was in Donabate fighting a fire along with crews from Kilbarrack and elsewhere in Dublin because they come together. It's not just a small service for a small community. The communities have expanded and they provide that service. They get up and do that. Firefighters do a professional job. They provide a first-class service. And yet all they seek this evening is respect, decent terms and conditions. Minister, they can't take applause down to the supermarket and try to use it to pay for their groceries, nor can they do that with a pat on the back. They're looking for respect, decency and decent wages.
Tully.
I welcome the motion here and commend my colleague John Brady for the work he has undertaken in bringing it forward today. Retained firefighters are first responders and very often first on the scene of awful tragedies that we can only imagine. I mean, it's a dangerous job, it's enormous pressure. Firefighters are facing very real fears for their personal safety. I mean, firefighters go into burning buildings to make sure the rest of us are out of them, that it's clear of people. They go to cars to cut people out, even though that car might explode or burst into flames at any moment. And all of this has an emotional tally on both the firefighters and their families. However, conditions within the job have led to a recruitment and retention crisis. Now, firefighters are on call 24/7. They must be in the vicinity of the fire station at all times. And yet, the money they receive is not reflective of that commitment. And I mean, the retained fire services cannot recruit sufficient new members nor retain experienced personnel. So this has made an already dangerous and pressurised job even more so, as fire stations are being forced to operate with low crew numbers and in some cases resulting in fire authorities taking the decision to temporarily close stations. I mean, there are also issues around the failure of management to take seriously the concerns of firefighters in the provision of proper training, in consultation or supervision in the use of new technology, and that's in breach of the Health, Safety and Welfare Work Act of 2005. Indeed, it is the view that retained fire service in its current form is not fit for purpose. And those are not my words, they're the words of Mr Dave Carroll, the former head of the Chief Fire Officers Association. And he made those remarks back in 2018, but things have become even worse since then. The cost of living crisis has exacerbated this issue, and many retained firefighters have been forced to take up full-time employment. I mean, the job is not sufficiently paid to consider it full-time employment, so most have to take up work. But if they do so, then they're taxed to the hilt. One firefighter told me he received €5,000 for a 6-month period of his retainer and call-outs. He received €5,000 in theory, €1,700 actually is what he got into his hand after he was taxed. I mean, that doesn't encourage anybody to join and risk their lives for that. So I'm just urging the members here to back this motion. It's calling for the establishment of a cross-party joint Oireachtas committee. This issue has to be urgently resolved. It has to be for the safety of both the crew and the members of the public. Thank you.
Deputy Brady.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach. Minister, members of the retained service and their family members they marched in Dublin today, marched on the Dáil, and some sat for the duration of this debate. They came here out of frustration, they came looking for hope and respect, whilst all they got from government benches was words. That's all they got, because they got no hope, they got very little respect. But what they did get was a classic case of kicking the can down the road. And that is what has been done here by the introduction of the government amendment. Because this motion was penned by the members of the retained service themselves, because they feel their voice has not been listened to by anybody in government up to this point. So your counter motion, the amendment, actually just nullifies, totally dismisses everything that they have said. What your motion does is basically say, we're great, we're doing everything is going to be resolved. But there's no definitive timelines. I've heard repeatedly that the Minister will bring forward the review and the recommendations in December. No date whatsoever. Now, bearing in mind, the Minister has been sitting on this review and the recommendations since February or March of this year. So that in itself gives a very clear indication as to how serious the Minister and Government are actually dealing with the crisis that is within the retained service. There was not one mention of either yourself, Minister, or from your colleague in relation to the balloting for industrial action. That members of the retained fire services felt that they had no option because the processes that they've engaged in up until this point has not produced any meaningful solutions to the crisis. They have served notice on all CEs, chief executives in all the local authorities, going back a number of weeks ago. The balloting is actually taking place now as we speak, Minister. And in some areas, 97% of retained firefighters are saying, yes, look, we have no other option. We don't want to go down this route, but we have to because our voices are not being heard. And they are, absolutely, as a last resort, prepared to take industrial or full strike action because they have no faith whatsoever in the government to actually follow through and implement what is contained in this report. Now, the motion itself, Minister, could actually complement the process that has been initiated, not just recently. I mean, firefighters were asked to input into that review last year. Last year, 900 of them actually partook in that review. But that's all it was, words, no action has come through. So what we have asked for, what the firefighters have asked for, is the creation of a cross-party, a Oireachtas committee to look at this issue, to get under the bonnet of the retained service, to look at all of the issues, Minister, over a four-month period and bring back those recommendations. And I think that could and should complement whatever review is being undertaken. And more importantly, it will give a level of accountability and responsibility to government to implement and to follow through And whatever comes out of that, I have my own views, the firefighters have their own views in terms of the Working Time Directive that needs to be fully implemented. And I think that will go a long, long way to addressing all of the concerns that we have heard from right across the chamber here this evening, Minister. But unfortunately, all we have got from government is words. And there's one line in the counter motion here, and I think when members of the service were sitting up in the gallery, I don't know whether the Minister noticed it, the vast majority of them actually got up and walked out after the Minister spoke, because they felt that coming in here, the morale was on the ground, and I think that just sunk morale even further. But in the counter motion, there's one paragraph here that says, while the recruitment and retention issues are serious, it is important nevertheless to place these issues in the context of a service that has repeatedly been shown to be operational ready and resilient. It goes on to talk about COVID. So that, in my mind, is a department, a minister that is conscious of the serious challenges, but is happy because he knows the guys are going to get up and get out and to respond as they always do, despite the major challenges, despite the shortage of personnel on the ground. So, Minister, I would appeal again to pull the amendment, to support the motion, show full support for the retained firefighters and the communities in which they serve. Minister, pull the amendment, support the motion. Let's get this committee going and start putting in place a service that is fit for purpose.
That therefore completes our consideration of the motion regarding retained firefighters. And we must first then consider the amendment in the name of the Minister. And the question is that the amendment be made. Is that agreed? Not agreed. Not agreed. Na chakli atar hef na tarish gonna aberdis ta. Shivshin gonna aberdis neil. Estolim gonna kesh rich vote all insofar as the vote has been called. The vote is deferred until voting time tomorrow evening. Thank you all for your